Perhaps we can think of episodes in our own lives where we have felt constrained by dominant religious voices who have told us that we are wrong, that we are sinners, that we are doomed to perdition, to damnation, because we deviate from accepted religious teachings or communal norms. And of course, we know that for many, many people in our societies, and I'm speaking here about relatively secularized Western societies, there is a dominant narrative nowadays that religion does not set you free, that religion is a force for constraint, for servitude, and above all, for conflict between groups and between peoples. So for many in our society, religion as a whole has been tarred with that brush of tyranny, of mind control, the opiate of the people, keeping the masses in subjection to priests and self-proclaimed religious rulers. So which is the truth? Does religion set us free or does it not? One way to approach this is to say it depends what kind of religion, and that's very much something that I'll be exploring in this time with you. Some religion sets you free, but a lot of religion doesn't. I grew up as a Jewish boy in Sydney, Australia, in a traditional, not strictly religious family, but attending an Orthodox synagogue and growing up very excited by the possibilities of study and religious observance. And by the time I was about 14, I knew that I wanted to be a rabbi, an Orthodox rabbi, following in the footsteps of my rabbi who inspired me with his leadership in Sydney. But as I was growing up through adolescence, as all of us do in one way or another, I was also experiencing sexual urges, which I knew were condemned by my religious tradition. In some way, all sexual urges are discouraged by many religious traditions, and that perhaps is one of the more absurd aspects of many traditional religions. But certainly the kinds of urges I was experiencing as a teenager, attraction to my own sex, is something that I knew was strictly forbidden. So I had to compartmentalize that part of myself, lock it away. Occasionally it burst forth, and I saw myself as submitting to a kind of temporary insanity. This came with a great deal of self-hatred, self-flagellation, so that by the time I was in my 20s, religious life was a kind of perpetual torment. On the one hand, was what I knew I ought to be. On the other hand, what I increasingly understood as what I actually was. And the two seemed to be in an irreconcilable conflict. Of course, many people would have submitted to the religious rules and the communal norms, and countless people have done so over the ages and have probably lived lives of devout unhappiness as a result, and perhaps often involved others in their misery, entering into loveless and unsatisfying marriages with the incalculable effect that has on a partner, on children, and on oneself. Fortunately, perhaps I'd been lucky in knowing gay people and realizing that it was possible to be openly gay and to live a happy and fulfilled life. And so as I'd come over to London at that point to complete my rabbinic studies after various twists and turns and travels along the way, which I won't bore you with, I found myself as a rabbinic student more and more unhappy. I was aware of a rabbi in London called Rabbi Lionel Blue, a name that might be known slightly to some of you. And Rabbi Lionel Blue had come out publicly in 1988 after a long and distinguished career as a Reform rabbi. The fact that he was gay was an open secret. All of his friends and colleagues knew it, but the wider British public didn't. And Lionel Blue was a popular broadcaster, writer, television personality, much loved for his wonderful, gentle sense of humor and deep, deep humanity. The News of the World, one of the populist tabloid rags of the time, was about to out him with all kinds of scandalous headlines, but he preempted them and came out on his own terms in The Guardian, a reputable national newspaper in Britain, in the summer of 1988. I arrived a few months later in the autumn, but I already knew about Lionel Blue from years before. One of my detours from Judaism, when I'd spent many holidays staying with my best friend, who was a Carmelite friar, a Catholic friar, trading for the priesthood. And I'd stayed in Carmelite monasteries. And it was there I first heard about Lionel Blue, this strange rabbi who liked to make retreats in Carmelite monasteries, particularly in Oxford. And I was asked if I knew about him. I didn't, but I later would. I read a book of his at that difficult time. It was called A Back Door to Heaven, a sort of spiritual autobiography. And I sensed in those pages a kindred spirit, someone in whom I could confide all the agony that I was experiencing with the clashes in my life. And so I arranged to go and visit him. It took some time because he was frequently away. He loved traveling. But when eventually I did go and see him, I walked into his house in Finchley in North London and was greeted with these words. The sharing takes a minute. So I walked into the house and I heard these words, "Hello, ducky." Now, that might seem completely inoffensive, but the idea of a rabbi addressing me as ducky, which is a northern British term of endearment, was really quite shocking and absolutely liberating. And was those two words, "Hello, ducky," that I sensed a new possibility of freedom. Now, I would later learn that one of Lionel Blue's favorite watchwords was something that he had learnt from a very distinguished teacher of his. And I'll share with you a passage from an interview which he gave a few years ago, in which he told the story. This print is slightly small there. He tells the story of when he was a student at Balliol College, Oxford in the 1950s, and saw an advertisement asking for young Jewish men of good education to apply to become rabbis. And he thought this might be a sign from God for how to spend his life. Lionel had been beset by all sorts of religious and political doubts. He'd found inspiration from the Quakers and from other religious circles, but very little in his own Jewish origins. When he first dipped into Reform Judaism, he found that the service was far from the kind of Judaism that he'd known as a kid in a shtibel, a small East End Jewish, Eastern European type Jewish community. It didn't seem to connect at all. So he said no to that. Then his mother, and I was fortunate enough to know Lionel's mother, who was quite a character, they had a series of phone calls. And first of all, she said she'd commit suicide if I became a rabbi. As the old joke goes, what sort of job is that for a nice Jewish boy? Be a doctor, be a lawyer, be a businessman, but a rabbi? And then Lionel said, well, maybe I'll become a monk instead. Oh no, she said, I'm going to commit suicide. This is Jewish guilt for you. And then she rang up and said, Lionel, become a rabbi. It's the least worst of them all. So I said, okay. Well, I was lucky. I came along to see what it was like, and I liked it. I met Rabbi Leo Beck. Now, Leo Beck had been the leading rabbi of German Jewry in the years before and during the Second World War, during the Nazi period, had narrowly escaped from the devastation of the Holocaust, having been a prisoner in Theresienstadt concentration camp. And he spent a brief time in England after the war. He died in the mid-50s. But Lionel Blue met him, and Leo Beck said a sentence to him which had become very important. He said, Lionel, Judaism is your religious home. It's not your religious prison, which was good. And so I've entitled this talk today, Our Home, Not Our Prison. If we can see religion not as a prison constraining us, but as a home in which we feel free to express ourselves, a home that we also feel free to leave, to wander around, to visit others, to explore beyond, but then a place that we can come back to and find acceptance. That's a kind of religion which does set us free. I want to turn now to some key teachings, firstly from my own Jewish tradition, in which I find the potential for liberation, for true freedom. You'll recognize this as the beginning of the 10 Commandments. I am your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Now, in most Christian traditions, it continues, you shall have no other gods besides me. You shall not worship graven images. But in Jewish tradition, you shall have no other gods besides me is not the first commandment. It's the beginning of the second commandment. It's worth saying that in Jewish tradition, what Christians refer to as the 10 Commandments is actually called Aseret HaDibrot in Hebrew, the 10 sayings or the 10 utterances. And for some strange reason, Jewish tradition has always understood the first of the 10 utterances to be simply these words, I am your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. If we regard this as the first of the 10 commandments, the obvious question is, what does it command? It doesn't seem to command anything at all. It's God introducing God's self. So Jewish tradition has come up with a number of answers as to what is commanded in this first commandment. According to Moses Maimonides, the great rationalist philosopher, it's a commandment to know God, to immerse oneself in the knowledge of God. But I would like to find something different in this, understood as the first of the 10 commandments. I am your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. To me, this implies that the very beginning of all commandments is freedom. In order to attach ourselves to the God who introduces themselves in these words, we need to be free. This coming Sunday night is the beginning of the Jewish festival of Shavuot, or Pentecost, the festival of the giving of the Torah, when we read out the Ten Commandments ceremonially on the anniversary, in legendary terms, of their first promulgation. It's the culmination of the 7 weeks of counting from Passover, which was the beginning of freedom, the exodus from Egypt. But that's a freedom of leaving slavery, of becoming free of all constraint, all political domination and tyranny. But is that complete freedom? The Jewish answer is no. That isn't complete freedom. There is a kind of freedom which is freedom from all restraint, but there is a higher type of freedom which is subjecting ourselves willingly and voluntarily to a higher law. This is indicated in a famous teaching from a work called The Chapters of the Fathers, part of the Mishnah, the original work of Rabbinic Judaism. Rabbi Joshua ben Levi in the 3rd century gave this teaching, quoting Exodus 32, "And the tablets were the work of God, and the writing was the writing of God, graven upon the tablets." The word graven in Hebrew is charut. But Rabbi Joshua ben Levi said, don't read it charut, graven, read instead chirut, freedom. It's a change of one vowel. And of course, the Hebrew text in the Torah scroll is written without vowels. You can put in your own vowels. So he says, don't read it as charut, the literal, obvious meaning. Read it instead as chirut, freedom. Freedom upon the tablets. In what sense? Are the commandments on the tablets of stone freedom? Because only when we accept that there are constraints on complete license can we create a society together in which the strong, the powerful, the energetic can't simply do whatever they want and control others and impinge on the rights and freedoms of others. Only when there are laws, do not murder, do not steal, do not break the faithfulness of partnerships, don't bear false witness. Only then can we create a society of maximum freedom for everybody, when those who are less powerful, less strong, less energetic do not have to live their lives in fear, because there is a higher law accepted by all, freedom upon the tablets of stone. Going back just for a moment, most of you will be familiar, I imagine, with the traditional translation of the Ten Commandments, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. And I've deliberately not written Lord there. Lord is indeed Adonai, the way in which we in Judaism read the Hebrew, putting in the word Adonai, Lord. And that's because we don't pronounce the mysterious name of God, Yod He Vav He, the Tetragrammaton. It probably means something like being itself, or the one who causes to be, or the eternal one. But we simply don't pronounce it. We leave a mystery there, a sort of silence, which we fill with the conventional word Lord. But nowadays in liberal Judaism, because we believe in gender-inclusive language, we've given up masculine terms like Lord and Father in favor of using more inclusive terms that don't privilege one gender over another. So I am that energy of being, your God, who sets you free, who brings you true liberation. by inviting you to accept constraints on your complete freedom for the sake of everybody else. So true freedom involves a commitment to justice, equality, and therefore liberation for all. It's a lovely coincidence that our reading from the Torah yesterday, on the Sabbath yesterday, was Leviticus chapter 25, which contains within it the Jubilee ideal. And in the Jubilee ideal, every 50th year, all property reverts to its original owners, if indeed there were ever truly original owners. There's something slightly mythological about that conception. But the ideal is there that you sound the horn loud and proclaim freedom throughout the land for all its inhabitants. All debts are cancelled. All slaves in that ancient slave-owning society were set free. And everybody attained a pristine equality that had been lost because the way the world works, some people fall into poverty and others enrich themselves. But every so often, there should be a restoration of that pristine equality, that pristine freedom, which is the inalienable right of every human being in this biblical vision. Of course, it's a great ideal. Was it ever truly carried out in practice in ancient Israelite society? Probably not, or not completely at any rate. But it remains there as a challenge and an inspiration for us. And I know this isn't from my religious tradition, but of course, religion is not my prison, it's my home. And so I like to think I can pay a visit now and then to the Christian scriptures as to the scriptures of other faiths. And we see here a famous passage, I'm sure well known to many of you, in which Jesus read the scroll of Isaiah in the synagogue in Nazareth. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me because he has anointed me to proclaim good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim liberty to the captives and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. This is Jesus embracing that Jubilee principle and the potential of religion, perhaps of his messianic self-understanding as the servant of God, to bring freedom to the oppressed, freedom in the most practical sense. And we can't divorce our faith from our obligation to society to work for freedom. So having shared these religious ideals, I want to turn now to insights of a more contemporary kind. It was in 2017 at a conference held by the World Congress of Faiths in London that, to my wonder, I was first exposed to the ideas of psychology of religion. Having been a rabbi for decades, it astonished me that somehow I'd never managed before to find out about the fascinating insights offered by psychology of religion. This came in a way as a kind of liberating force for me at that moment. This is based on research a long time ago now in the United States, in the 1950s and 60s, which suggested that religious affiliation correlated positively with racial prejudice. The more religious people were, the more likely they were to harbor prejudice. A shocking idea, but one that was borne out by sociological studies at that time. Now, of course, those were different days from now, and of course we can expect that the religious picture has changed in all kinds of ways in the ensuing 60, 70 years. But in 1967, further research done by the important social scientist Gordon Allport and J.M. Ross distinguished different ways of being religious, which refined this picture of religion correlating with racial prejudice. This was obviously amongst white American Christians predominantly. And they called these two orientations extrinsic and religious, and intrinsic religious orientation. I imagine these are words that will be familiar with most people, but for those who are not native English speakers, extrinsic means outside, external, outward looking, something that is not of the essence, and intrinsic means internal, something that is of the essence, in this case, of a person. Extrinsic religious orientation is typified by these three conceptual components. Compartmentalization, that is the separation of religion from the rest of life. In other words, you go to church on Sunday, or for that matter, synagogue on Saturday, and the rest of the time you live, as it were, apart from any particular religious framework. Secondly, social support, or the use of religion to achieve social ends. And thirdly, personal support, or the use of religion to gain personal comfort. In other words, it's an instrumentalization of religion. Sorry, that's why I couldn't move to it. Now, from the seminal article in which this was laid out by Allport and Ross, it says this: persons with this orientation are disposed to use religion for their own ends. They may find religion useful in a variety of ways to provide security and solace, sociability and distraction, status and self-justification. And we all know people who use religion as a way of bolstering their sense of self-importance. I may have done that myself now and then in my life, quite possibly. The embraced creed is lightly held, or else selectively shaped to fit more primary needs. Typical statements in questionnaires used in the sociological methods of these researchers to measure different orientations would be, in the case of extrinsic orientation, although I believe in my religion, I feel that there are many more important things in my life. Or it doesn't matter so much what I believe, as long as I lead a moral life. Extrinsic religious orientation was found to correlate with greater racial prejudice. But alongside that, they discovered that there is another orientation, which they called intrinsic religious orientation. And the three conceptual components of that were, and of course, this is all very highly simplified, and I invite you, if you're interested, to search out more nuanced and complex accounts of these ideas. But integration, or the close relationship between religion and the rest of life. Public religion, or the importance given to church, synagogue, or mosque for religious ends. And thirdly, personal religion, or the importance given to personal prayer and reading for religious ends. So that religion is not just something you do on a Sunday morning or a Saturday morning or a Friday lunchtime, but something that occupies more of your time. Persons with this orientation find their master motive in religion. Other needs, strong as they may be, are regarded as of less ultimate significance, and they are, so far as possible, brought into harmony with the religious beliefs and prescriptions. Having embraced a creed, the individual endeavors to internalize it and follow it fully. It is in this sense that they live their religion. Typical statements which were assented to in questionnaires were, "It is important for me to spend periods of time in private religious thought and meditation," or, "If not prevented by unavoidable circumstances, I attend church." And it was found that such an intrinsic orientation correlated positively with less racial prejudice. In other words, the more people held this intrinsic orientation, the less likely they were to hold prejudiced views towards people of other races. In American context, of course, it was African Americans. So when it came to the question of religion and prejudice, the results were that religion both makes and unmakes prejudice. This made sense to the researchers because those with an intrinsic orientation more likely to have internalized core religious teachings about love of neighbor, about all people reflecting the divine image and God's equal love for all. Things became much more complicated, however, when researchers added other sorts of prejudice, not just racial prejudice, such as, most notably in the context of this research, prejudice against LGBT people. At the time, it was homosexuals primarily. Then it was found that while those with an extrinsic religious orientation still displayed heightened prejudice compared with those who were not religious at all, those with intrinsic orientation displayed even more homophobic prejudice. On reflection, this too made sense because homosexuals were a group disapproved of by most religious traditions. So the more people had internalized the teachings of their tradition, the more prejudice they would display towards disapproved groups. So for those with extrinsic orientation, the more religious they were, the more prejudice they displayed towards all groups, while those of an intrinsic religious orientation were less prejudiced towards approved groups, such as people of a different race or skin color, race being a nonsensical term, but more prejudice towards disapproved groups like LGBT people, or for that matter, atheists. So in 1976, another researcher named Daniel Batson suggested that extrinsic and intrinsic did not adequately describe the range of religious orientations, and that alongside them there was another that needed to be taken into account, and he called it quest orientation. The three components he identified of quest orientation are readiness to face existential questions without reducing their complexity, self-criticism and perception of religious doubt as something positive, not as something threatening to religious identity. And thirdly, an openness to change. Batson wrote, an individual who approaches religion in this way recognizes that he or she does not know and probably never will know the final truth about theological matters. But still, the questions are deemed important, and however tentative and subject to change, answers are sought. There may not be a clear belief in a transcendent reality, in a traditional concept of God, but there is a transcendent religious dimension to the individual's life. Typical statements associated with this quest orientation in questionnaires were, it might be said that I value my religious doubts and uncertainty, or that questions are far more central to my religious experience than are answers. Batson and other social psychologists found that those who displayed a quest orientation were less prejudiced all round, both towards approved groups like racial minorities and towards traditionally disapproved groups like homosexuals, for instance. Now, I imagine that many of you here, particularly those of you from a Unitarian background, but perhaps all of us who would come to an IARF gathering, probably identify ourselves mostly with that quest orientation. For me, this came as something of a revelation because I didn't know until I attended that talk by an academic at Goldsmiths University, held by the World Congress of Faiths, that there was a sociological category into which I fitted so neatly, so perfectly, as this quest orientation, as someone who feels that my religious life has been a constant quest and has taken me into all manner of interesting, sometimes surprising, sometimes even slightly shocking places, has found me bowing in worship with Muslims and feeling liberated by that experience, that physical as well as spiritual experience of bowing down and prostrating myself with Muslim friends with whom I found a deep, deep kinship, even though my conception of God was probably quite radically different from that of most of those in the same row bowing down along with me. Found myself deeply attracted to Christianity and to the idea of a God who experiences human suffering and shares in the deepest pain of humanity and lifts that up to a higher level. I've come to feel that the true kinship between religious traditions, whether monotheist or not explicitly monotheist, like the Dharmic traditions of Asia, is to be found at the level of mysticism, at the level of deep personal experience, where great religious thinkers have reached the intuition that reality as a whole is one, that there is nothing truly separating us and God, us and one another, but that all is one unity. To me, that has become the deepest understanding of the Jewish declaration of faith that we say every day. Hear, O Israel, the eternal one is our God, the eternal God is one. Not that there is one God out there, but that we are all part of that one divinity, that one holy unity. This too came as a moment of liberation, of deep and profound liberation for me. Even after I'd gone through the process of coming out to myself and accepting that I was gay, while I was still an Orthodox rabbi, I knew that I desperately needed to find a way out of the framework in which I was living, that I could no longer continue with integrity to preach as an Orthodox rabbi and to lead an Orthodox community. It was in Watford, in North London, the north of London, where I was serving as a rabbi in the early 1990s. I knew that there were liberal forms of Judaism out there, but somehow I couldn't see how I could become part of that, because for me, God was still the transcendent, patriarchal God, the giver of the Torah, the commander of the laws, the one who judges, the one who demands that we submit ourselves to the traditional religious laws. And somehow, even though I'd come to understand all of the biblical critical theories that prove that the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses, were not dictated to Moses, that they're made up of documents written by human beings over many centuries, reflecting different religious ideologies. I knew all of that intellectually, but emotionally, I couldn't break out of that orthodox framework. And I knew that I couldn't survive within it. Sorry, I shared that prematurely. It was at that moment, and it was in December 1991, that I read two books simultaneously. Well, like many of us, I suppose, I'm always reading several books at a time. I read a book by Judith Plaskow, a great feminist theologian. It had just been published, called Standing Again at Sinai, a book of a pioneering work of Jewish feminist theology, claiming that we needed to rethink Judaism. We needed to rethink God and Torah and what it means to be Jewish in the light of the understanding of feminism, of the fundamental equality of men and women, and what that demanded of us. At the same time as I was reading that, I read the great novel, which I imagine many of you here have also read, called The Color Purple. And in The Color Purple, I found this passage in the culminating central chapter where Celie, the main character who has lived a life of almost unbelievable degradation, oppression, poverty, sexual and physical abuse, is talking to her friend Shug, the liberated singer who has broken away from her religious upbringing, although she still finds it meaningful. And she realizes that Celie is bound to the white man's God, very much the white man's patriarchal, masculine, dominating God. And she tries to teach Celie that that's not what God really is. Here's the thing, say Shug. I'm not going to try and do it in a southern accent. The thing I believe, God is inside you and inside everybody else. You come into the world with God, but only them that search for it inside find it. And sometimes it just manifests itself, even if you're not looking or don't know what you're looking for. Trouble do it for most folks, I think. Sorrow, Lord. Feeling like shit. It? I ask, that's Celie. It? You calling God it? Yeah, says Shug. It. God ain't a he or a she, but a it. But what do it look like? I ask. Don't look like nothing, she say. It ain't a picture show. It ain't something you can look at apart from anything else, including yourself. I believe God is everything, says Shug. Everything that is or ever was or ever will be. And when you can feel that and be happy to feel that, you've found it. In the same chapter come these sentences. Shug challenges Celia and says, have you ever found God in a church? I never did. I just found a bunch of folks hoping for him to show. Any God I ever felt in church, I brought in with me. And I think all the other folks did too. They come to church to share God, not find God. I think it pisses God off if you walk by the color purple in a field somewhere and don't notice it. Because that's where the book gets its name, The Color Purple. And that's why everything is purple in my slides. People think pleasing God is all God cares about. But any fool living in the world can see it always trying to please us back. And that's why I tell people that I was liberated by feminist theology and feminist writing by Judith Plaskow in Standing Again at Sinai and Alice Walker in The Color Purple. It was through that feminist revelation that I learnt that the patriarchal, law-giving, judging God, which was all that I'd ever been taught, is an idol we set up, an idol that oppresses us, an idol that betrays the reality of God. It was that writing that burst on me like a thunderclap and showed me that it was okay. I was allowed to stop being an Orthodox rabbi and an Orthodox Jew. And this is no criticism of those who are Orthodox Jews or Orthodox rabbis, many of whom are deeply beautiful, enlightened, humane, loving people. This is only my own personal journey and my own personal theology that I'm sharing a little tiny bit of with you. But this was my way to liberation. It was my way to realize that religion can set you free. I knew that I couldn't live without religion. I tried that once before. I decided to become an agnostic, to leave it all behind. I lasted about 6 weeks as an agnostic. I'm one of those people who, for whatever reason, I think it might be genetics, I'm pretty sure it is genetics, needs to find some deeper meaning, some inner certainty, some to believe that there is a truth out there. But I could only ultimately find that through this liberating power of a kind of religion that sets you free. Later on, I would discover the Jewish philosopher Spinoza, Baruch Spinoza of Amsterdam in the 17th century, who was excommunicated by the Jewish community for his daring thoughts, who would have identified with the words of Shug in The Color Purple. I find God in everything. God is the unity, the totality of all that is. Now, of course, pantheism or whatever kind of theism that is can also become an orthodoxy, and I'm not trying to impose that orthodoxy on anyone. But for me, this came as the most tremendous force of liberation. That's what I wanted to share with you today, my friends. People I hope will become friends as I spend more time with you. And I hope that I've conveyed the idea that while religion can enslave, there is the most tremendous potential in all spiritual traditions for liberation, and that religion can set us free as individuals, but also show us the way to come together in all of our different spiritual traditions and none, in order to help set the people of the world free, something that is so desperately needed now. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Mark. It was a beautiful story, and I suppose quite a few people would like to react, would like to ask you something. And so if you would like to say something, to ask Rabbi Mark a question, please raise your hand, either in preferably using Zoom's option to raise your hand, because then it's easier for us to say you, or you can just unmute yourself and speak.
Thank you for your lovely words of appreciation. That's really lovely.
I think that maybe the reason why no one there is art, but I just wanted to say that maybe the reason why people are not rushing to talk to you to ask questions is because we need to process what you said. It was a very emotional story, a very personal one, and I for one can identify with a lot of what you said, myself being gay and raised in an Orthodox religion, a different one, but I think the experience is very much comparable. So it was really something very deep experience. So thank you. At please.
Yes, I think maybe that nobody reacts straight away because we completely agree with you in the way you explained. Not all the religions are the same because you have chosen to go for Judaism and you just serve as a rabbi, but on the other hand you have an openness to every other religion. So while Judaism is your home, you are free to leave your home, like all of us, and then look for others, and then you recognize something which is similar. Maybe they express it in other ways, like the Hindus with this unity of all. You mentioned great philosopher Spinoza, who is very popular and also open for several interpretations. So, I mean, he has also roots in Judaism very clearly, and I think the congregation in Amsterdam made a big mistake by ostracizing him. But on the other hand, there is really a depth of religious favor in all his writings. In fact, he's very critical in his social political tractate. He's very critical towards religion, but only to the outward forms. And he says religion is very often misused just to keep people in power. Let me just say thank you for your very valuable contribution, and it keeps us a lot of thinking, some of reflection. I made some notes, and now I go further into it.
Thank you so much. Lukasz, would you like me to respond, or is there not time? I'm not sure what
there is time, but maybe we can take another reaction,
sure.
and then you can respond to them both. Morgana, I see everyone. I'm just going by. Oh yes, but she's also raised her hand. So I think Johannes was the second one. Please, Johannes.
Hi, yeah, thank you. I don't have any questions. It's more about that I want to thank you because I'm also in a personal and spiritual religious search now, and you brought me so much further with you things you said in your presentation, and just want to thank you because it makes me really happy to listen to you, and yes, I just want to thank you.
Thank you very much.
So since it wasn't a question, Esther?
Yes, I don't have a question. I also want to thank you. And of course, I appreciate it very much that you are going to read feminist theologians. You cited Blasco and you cited Walker. My question is, did you also read Rosemary Radford-Ruser?
The answer to that is a quick one. I haven't yet. No, I know of her, and I've read a lot about her, mainly in what Jewish feminist theologians have said about her. And there are obviously she made a huge contribution. There were. I think I'll leave it at that. So yes, I haven't yet read her own works, but thank you for reminding me that's something that I should do.
There's just one book which I'm rereading again now,
Yes.
which is, I don't know the English text, but it is translated Nächstenliebe und Brudermord.
Mhm.
Fratricide and love of the neighbor, which is for the Jewish-Christian dialogue. She's very critical to Christian tradition, and I just hope to find somebody to exchange about it.
Thank you, Esther. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Esther. Morgana, please.
Yes, thank you. First of all, congratulations on a most inspirational talk. I was absolutely thrilled. I was trying to make quotes all the time, possibly to be used on a panel discussion I'm leading on Tuesday. So that's the first thing, Mark. Absolutely brilliant. But my question is, I noticed again that you were had interactions with feminists and readings, but of course, it's always the question of what is the role of women today within Judaism. But I mean, I know there are female rabbis. I know Pamela Friedman from America. She was actually at the Parliament of World Religions in 2018 after the Washington conference we had as well. So it was lovely to speak with her. But how have you seen that? The influence of women in the United Kingdom? How has that changed in the United Kingdom?
Okay, I'd love to answer that, but maybe we'll hear the other questions. And that's a very easy question to remember. And I
of course. Yes.
Yeah? Thank you, Morgana. Thank you.
Thank you, Morgana, very much. Pascal, please.
Thank you very much, Mark Solomon, for this impressive lecture and sharing your experiences. And I was remembered of Erich Fromm. Maybe you heard of him?
Yes.
And his escape from freedom, for example, and his psychoanalysis and religion. And I asked myself, would you differentiate your thesis you brought up from the scientific way? Would you add the terms of Erich Fromm to them? That means humanitarian religion and authoritarian religion, because I think this doesn't exclude your thoughts on extrinsic and intrinsic, but maybe it's a wider dimension. I don't know how to explain it. And two short comments. You said the word charut and cherut are interpreted by the reading. You have the vocals. You can choose how to read it. And I think in Islam or in Arabic, it's the same with the Quran. And because of this, many theologians there are discussing either. Yes, and the last one is about the series. It's called Unorthodox. Maybe you know the series. It's coming up on Netflix, and it's a quite good book from Deborah Feldman. And yes, I was associating all the time with that. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Pascal.
I see that we have one more person raising their hand, so maybe we will allow this question also to be asked. Valerie, please.
Okay, thank you. Toda Rabba, Reb Salomon, for your brilliant lecture. But you see, I found one thought during the lecture. You said about intrinsic and extrinsic religiosity. And I thought maybe we can say about religion as a home and as a prison in two aspects. If your religion is based upon faith and is only the external form of your spiritual life, it is a home. if your religion is a part of your national, ethnic, and identity, it can be prison. And I guess, knowing Judaism, that Judaism passes through it. For example, I think, and my question is, do you agree to some way with some thought that Judaism of Torah is a whole? It makes us free. But Judaism of Talmud and later Shulchan Aruch makes from it prison. For example, and you know that after the Talmudic period appeared such streams as Karaim and so on, which recognized only Torah. What is your opinion?
Right, that's a really interesting question, fascinating question, a big issue. I'm happy to deal with it, but I'll probably come back to that later because I want to deal with some of the others first. That's a much more internal Jewish debate in a way than an interfaith one, but I'm happy to touch on it, and I hope I can say something sensible about it. I don't know if Dorothee...
Yes, actually we have two more people, so if you can keep up with making notes, then maybe we can hear from them. So first was actually raising his hand. I'm sorry, my apologies, I'm not seeing everyone. Dr. Andreas, please.
That's all I wanted to say.
Okay.
Unmute yourself. Oh my God. Der richtige Knopf.
Ja.
Jetztle.
Jetztle?
Jetzt geht's.
No.
Nochmal.
Nochmal?
Jetzt ist
No,
gut.
it's fine. It's good.
Oh, it's fine.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Mr. Solomon, you showed three ways of religious attitude, the extrinsic, the intrinsic, and the third one, doubt.
Quest. It's called,
Quest.
Yes.
I interpret it as doubt because I have learned from Paul Tillich that doubt is always the shadow of faith, so it belongs together. But okay, Quest, what would you say is the way of Quest more nearer to intrinsic or to extrinsic? Probably to intrinsic, so that there are combinations. Would you probably agree to this? Instead of Quest, you could probably also talk about reason. That I would say that faith and reason always belongs together, and that's what for me IARF also stands for. Not an irrational but a rational form of religion helps against slavery, against oppression, I would say. Now, my second remark, you in the end tended to a sort of pantheism along Spinoza. Now, for me, as far as I know, a Jewish tradition, it's always the point of being against idolatry. And even Jews who were quite secularistic, Marx and Freud, always were very strong against idolatries. Now, how would you bring this together? On the one hand, pantheism, that God comprises all, and on the other hand, idolatry, or the fight against idolatry, that God is not an idol, and we shouldn't anything put aside God, but God is always higher and critical of all what we do. Did I make it clear what
That's a wonderful question. Thank you. I'll try to deal with it. It's a huge issue, and it's wonderful, and I'm very interested in it, and I'll try to address that as well. Thank you so much. Those two questions that you've both very profound that you've put.
Okay, we have maybe just time for one more, and I saw that Justina, you had your hand raised. If you could unmute yourself.
Yes. I just wanted to say you a lot of thank you for this very moving personal story. And I don't know if religion set us free, but such a brave person like you set us free, because you have opened the doors for your followers. Like I was surprised that the Rabbi Lionel Blue, like you said, it was so recently ago. So he was probably the first, and you are the followers. So thank you. And I think Dorle wanted to add something.
I think Dorle only wanted to bring my attention to the fact that Dr. Rüssler had his hand raised. Or do you have something else, Dorothy?
Sorry, that was all I wanted.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so very much to all of you for those fascinating comments and questions. I'm not sure I can do them all real justice, but let's come to the very practical question first of women that Morgana asked, and the role of Jewish women. So in the progressive Jewish movements, that is liberal and reform Judaism in their various forms in different countries, the principle of the absolute equality of women in religious life has been around for some time, since around the 1970s at the latest. Of course, principles and practice don't always go hand in hand, and it's taken a long time for that principle to become active in the life of all the progressive congregations. But I think it's now held as a fundamental value of progressive Judaism, which is also called Reform Judaism or Liberal Judaism, different names for the same thing. And that's the case in the United States and in Britain, to a perhaps slightly lesser extent on the continent of Europe, but even there it is quite important. As you said, there are women rabbis. The very first woman rabbi was ordained in 1934 in Berlin. Sadly, she perished in the Shoah, in the Holocaust, and nobody talked about her for many, many years, even those who actually knew her. So the first women rabbis after that were ordained in the United States in 1972 and in Britain in 1975. Rabbi Jackie Tabik, who is known to many of you, and she's the chair of the World Congress of Faiths, or co-chair of the World Congress of Faiths. What is absolutely marvelous, and I honestly didn't think it was going to happen as quickly as it has, is that now we have Orthodox women rabbis being ordained, mainly in the United States. It's still not widely accepted in the Orthodox Jewish world, but now that there are women rabbis operating within Orthodox, gradually going to be more and more widely accepted. There might be some parts of the Jewish community that will never quite accept it, but in modern Orthodoxy, the modern Orthodox, which is in a way the majority of Orthodox Jews, it will become more and more accepted. So we have at least one Orthodox woman rabbi now working in Britain, Rabbi Erin London. Another British woman, Dinah Brow, was ordained, but she's now back in the United States. So we have, this is the very beginnings, the first beginnings, still only a handful, but it's quite marvelous. We're living through a time of great and rapid change. Of course, it's not just about women rabbis, it's also about the role of women in other ways within Jewish communities. And in the mainstream British Orthodox movement, the United Synagogue, headed by the chief rabbi, while they're not ready to accept women rabbis, as far as I'm aware, it's only quite recently, a few years ago, the United Synagogue changed its rules so that women could be the lay chairs, the lay leaders of synagogues. And that was a major change in political structure within the British Orthodox community to allow women to occupy not only to be on the synagogue councils. That itself only happened, a couple of decades ago, I think, but now women can actually be the chairs of communities. So there is progress. On a feminist level, one has to ask questions. Is women occupying traditionally male leadership roles the real goal here? On one hand, it's important that women should occupy all the same leadership roles that men can occupy, but ultimately, if one's being a sort of a really good feminist, it should be about breaking down hierarchies, about discovering new, more egalitarian, more participatory ways of communities operating. And that too is happening, but it's happening a bit more slowly, I think. But it is also happening in all kinds of very rich and interesting ways.
Rabbi Mark,
thank you, Bob.
if I may.
Thank you, Bob, for that comment. Thank you very much, Bob. That's great to read. I invite everybody to read the comment that Rabbi Bob Carroll has put in the chat. Yes, Lukasz, sorry.
Yes, I apologize. I just wanted to interrupt you for 1 second. For those who haven't been with us since the morning, the devotion today was led together by Rabbi Bob and Rabbi Kodowicz, who is the first female rabbi ordained in Poland. And she is actually still with us. So just on the topic of female rabbis. Thank you.
That's lovely. Hi. Great to meet you. Moving to the next question, which was from Pascal, and it was firstly about the Erich Fromm distinction between humanitarian versus authoritarian religion. Yes, I think that maps on to some extent to the social psychological categories that I was introducing. Erich Fromm is, we have several passages from Erich Fromm in our prayer book, in fact, and his, although he had a very complex relationship with religious Judaism, he had said some beautiful things which we use as readings in our liturgy, another antinomy that exists, or another binary, is between autonomy and heteronomy, and that introduces all kinds of difficult questions which I didn't want to get into because it would take us into difficult philosophical areas. On a traditional Judaism certainly is strongly heteronymous in that it teaches that there is a law that is given to us which we must obey, and on a philosophical level the Kantian challenge was that true ethics must be autonomous. It must come from within, be generated from the individual rather than imposed from some tradition or divine lawgiver. And there's a lot of interesting writing in Jewish philosophy about how to reconcile these two. That although the Torah, our religious tradition, our law, starts off heteronymous, coming to us from outside, the ideal, the Jewish ideal, is that through a process of study, of questioning, of exploration, of debate, which is all integral to how Judaism operates, that we internalize that law and it becomes part of our autonomous being. Now that's an ideal in a way, and maybe lots of people never quite get to that, but I believe that is at a very deep level a Jewish spiritual ideal, that instead of obeying the Torah, we become the Torah, to put it in dramatic terms. And of course, well, I could go into an interfaith discussion about the sense in which Jesus became the Torah and is the Torah for Christians. But anyway, that's another discussion which I won't go into right now. Okay. Yes, you made a point about the charut and cherut and reading the word in different ways. In the rabbinic interpretations that use this as a hermeneutical tool, as a tool of interpretation, is not saying don't read it like this. In other words, give up that reading completely and instead read it like this. It says what it really means is don't just read it this way, also read it that way. So it's an inclusive hermeneutic rather than exclusive one, and it's allied to the idea of ancient rabbinic idea that there are 70 faces to the Torah, that everything in the Torah it has within it, by, as it were, divine design, many, many levels of interpretation, and studying Torah is a process of uncovering new levels of interpretation which are inherent within it. Of course, from a rationalist point of view, it's more eisegesis than exegesis, reading in rather than reading out, but on a spiritual level, that's a very important Jewish concept, and I'll come back to that, I think, in a minute. You asked about unorthodox, and yes, unorthodox is a dramatic and beautiful story, but it's also a reality. It's happening to many, many people. I have friends who have come from much, much more orthodox backgrounds than I did, from Hasidic backgrounds here in Britain, who grew up in Britain knowing absolutely nothing of wider British life, scarcely speaking English, having very little secular education, who have managed to break out of that community, and this is going on in many places in the Jewish world. It can be very, very difficult and traumatic for such people. And the reaction sometimes is to give up religion altogether, of course. For many people, religion itself does seem like a prison, and it's very hard to see it as a home in which you can move freely, and from which you can move freely. I had a question from Valeri, I think it was, about halacha. He didn't say that. You didn't say that, Valeri, but about rabbinic law and the Talmud and the code of Jewish law, and whether that in fact makes, as it were, the pristine biblical Judaism into a kind of prison by erecting more and more rules. The rabbis talk about making a fence around the Torah so that you don't come to break the biblical laws. They add extra layers of laws as preventative measures. So a fence does sound rather like a prison. So on that level, I can understand what you're saying. However, I think for me, and of course I'm not, I don't feel myself bound by the halakha, by the whole structure of rabbinic law, but even for many people who do, the halakha properly understood is a way of liberating the literal meaning of the biblical text into a much broader, more nuanced, and in some ways more liberal understanding. Now, it's not liberal enough for liberals like me, but it is certainly more liberal in a way than the biblical text itself. So where the biblical text says, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, and that may, it's still a question, but it may have been understood literally in biblical times as physical retribution. In rabbinic law, it becomes financial compensation for injury. Yeah, and the rabbis absolutely reject the idea of literally an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, and they, of course, the rabbis say that's never what the Torah actually meant. So in that way, I think the halakha was in its time a liberating force, and still has the potential to be that. And that's one of the great debates within Jewish life: how much is the halakha a dynamic, developing, open-ended system, and how much is it a closed system that has sort of experienced a kind of sclerosis where it stopped changing and become harder and harder, and there are many dividing lines within Jewish communities about different attitudes to that structure. But I'm certainly not someone who says that you need to go right back to the biblical text and only there can you find true liberation. I'm not sure that really works personally. Now, sorry, next one was a very powerful question from Andreas Rössler about, firstly, the combination of the extrinsic, intrinsic, and quest. I think what you were suggesting, and which I certainly agree with, are not exclusive categories that you have to be one or this or that, that all of us, complex individuals that we are, have multiple motivations and multiple levels of our spiritual lives, and why I might, as it were, hope that I'm mostly a quest-oriented person, open to change, open to doubts, open to questions, and free of all prejudice. Of course, we all have many levels within ourselves. I won't talk about all of us. I'll talk about myself. I know that for me, religion serves all kinds of ego purposes in my life. Being a rabbi is an ego trip. Being a religious leader of any kind is an ego trip. It gives you status. It gives you authority. Now, we all have to deal with those motivations within ourselves, and some of us do it better than others. But so there's that extrinsic level, I think, for all of us, and the intrinsic level in which the faith, the religion, the spirituality is part of our very being and is an end in itself rather than just a means to an end. They're all combined in various balances, I think. I'll tell you a little story. So why did I want to become a rabbi? The synagogue where I grew up, which was a big cathedral-style synagogue in Sydney, very beautiful, magnificent Victorian building. The rabbi stands on the pulpit, which is sort of 12 feet up in the air, somewhere between the men and the women up in the ladies' gallery. And I've always, you can't see me because I'm just sitting down, but if you saw me standing up, I'm only just over 5 feet tall. That's I don't know how much that is in meters, centimeters, but I'm very short, and I think as a short guy, the idea of standing up higher than everybody else, was quite a primal, powerful psychological motivation. When I was in yeshiva in a very orthodox religious college in Melbourne, when I was about 18, 19, 18, I became deeply depressed. Well, I've become depressed about lots of things, but one of the things I got depressed about was I started realizing that my motivations were less than pure. I was become mature enough that it dawned on me that, that there were ego reasons why I wanted to be a rabbi and so on and so forth. And it upset me deeply. And I was crying one day in the library in the yeshiva. And the Rosh Yeshiva, the head of the yeshiva, very learned rabbi, Rabbi Cohen, came in and found me and sat with me and said, "What's the matter?" So I told him this sort of insight that I'd gained, that my motives were impure, etc. And he said, "Welcome to the human race." And that stayed with me. We all have a mixture of motives for everything that we do. Okay, so you also asked about reason. Is reason, rationality, the way to a religion of freedom, to a religion that liberates rather than a religion that constrains and oppresses? And in many ways, of course, I absolutely agree with that. I'm a proudly Enlightenment person. I believe that the Enlightenment, the assertion of the right and power of reason to critique religious dogmas and social constructs is absolutely vital. And one of the things that really bothers me is the sustained attack on the Enlightenment, which has become more and more open in some religious circles. In fact, I know I might get into trouble for saying this. The late and much revered Chief Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, who was one of my teachers at Rabbinic College, and I knew him quite well. I was quite close to him at one point, and he was indeed a great and fantastic religious leader who did a huge amount for reconciliation between religions, but on one level, he was a bitter critic and opponent of the Enlightenment, and he traced many of the problems of, as he saw it, of the modern world, including, people doing what they wanted to the Enlightenment, and that's something that I obviously disagreed with him about, among a few other things, but that isn't to take away from the great contributions that he made. However, at the same time, important though reason is, thank you. Important though reason is, there is a valid critique of an over-reliance on reason and on the idea that through reason we can know everything that there is to be known, and that any rational person must agree with us because reason proves that things are true, and so on and so forth, and that there is a downside to that, and reason can become a bit of a tyrannical force intellectually. And I think that there's been a valid reaction from what in the Jewish world is called the Jewish spiritual renewal movement, and I'm sure there are parallels in other religious traditions, that has offered a critique of exclusive rationality or the attempt at exclusive rationality, and has insisted that we need to learn from the mystical tradition, that we need to listen to those parts of ourselves that are pre-rational or supra-rational or even occasionally irrational, and add that in. It doesn't mean negating reason, but it means tempering reason with a little bit of magic, a little bit of mysticism, an acknowledgement that there are things that we simply can't know, that there are levels even of ourselves that are not amenable to full understanding. And finally, I'm sorry if I'm going on at great length. I do apologize. I tend to give long answers. The final question was very powerful one about pantheism and whether that verges on idolatry. If we see God in everything, are we worshipping nature, the world itself, and betraying the profound teaching, certainly within our Jewish tradition, my Jewish tradition, that God is other, that God is utterly transcendent, that nothing in the world should be treated as God, because God is always beyond. That's a really powerful question, and one I've thought about quite a bit. There is an added question. Which I'll just add in before I turn to that, which is for me, as someone who's deeply devoted and committed to interfaith harmony and understanding and appreciation. We not only understand but appreciate and come to love one another's religions, and so the question arises, particularly with Hinduism, one of the great faith traditions of the world, isn't it idolatry? And shouldn't we as Jews therefore condemn it as idolatry? And most Hindus are absolutely clear and unapologetic about worshipping idols. Of course, from a deeper perspective, if one knows anything about the Vedanta tradition, Hindu philosophy and spirituality, it turns out to be deeply monistic, in some cases monotheistic, and a scholar who has written a lot about this is Rabbi Alon Goshen Gottstein. Some of you might know his name, who's written 2 books which I've recently haven't got a chance to read yet. One's called Same God, Other God, Judaism, Hinduism, and the Problem of Idolatry. And he comes to the conclusion that we don't need to see Hinduism as idolatry. That's nice to know. Okay, and I deeply believe that. But the deeper question that you asked about pantheism and idolatry, so theism insists that the transcendence of God must be understood ontologically, that the nature of God's being is other than, different from, utterly beyond the being of this physical world that we live in, and that the concept of transcendence, therefore, is an ontological concept. I don't believe that, and I acknowledge most Jews who believe in God probably do believe that in some shape or form, but people, certainly in the progressive Jewish world, are increasingly questioning that. I think the idea of divine transcendence is extremely important, because without it we do risk falling into idolatry, ultimately worshipping ourselves, which is the real idolatry. But the concept of transcendence, I think, has to be shifted from ontology, from the question of being, to epistemology, which is the question of knowing. So it's not that God is other than everything, it's that the sense in which the oneness of God means the unity of all being, the ultimate unity of all being, which is God, is at such a deep epistemological level that it's inaccessible to our ordinary everyday minds and our ordinary everyday way of going about our lives. In order to live effective lives in the world, we have to treat things as different things, people as different people, entitled to be different from us. But for me, the transcendence comes not at the ontological level, but at the epistemological level, that the true understanding of the ultimate unity of all being is so deep. So you can call it high. Transcendence is usually linked with height, but for me it's more depth, the innermost depth of our being, which Jewish mysticism says is a spark of God, as it were. And that deepest level of our being, as the mystics teach, is generally inaccessible to us. That's the transcendent, that deepest level, that which all is one, but which is hidden from us in our ordinary physical lives. Does that make any sense? I hope it does. I'm sorry if it's a little bit too intellectual or mystical or something for some people, but that's how I make sense of the important idea of transcendence, while at the same time embracing a kind of pantheism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Mark. It was a tremendous time listening to you, and yes, thank you very much. I think I speak on behalf of everyone present. Thank you.